Welcome to the Synoptic Gospel Overview of the Gospel Series, Part 3, an overview of the four Gospels. Now we will briefly examine each of the four Gospel accounts that are found in the New Testament. It is noted that little can be known for certain about the four Gospel accounts that open the New Testament, even who actually wrote them, or where, or when they were written, although scholars have been hotly debating these details for almost 2,000 years. And no doubt the debate will continue, especially as new, and I say new, but they are probably older manuscripts, from sources such as the Dead Sea Scrolls and other documents and fragments, continue to be uncovered into the future. Anyway, it is unlikely that with the exception of John, and possibly also Matthew, the other Gospel accounts of Mark and Luke were definitely written by men who had not actually ever met Jesus. As mentioned, each Gospel is written to emphasize a different aspect of Jesus, and while all four of the Gospels mention that Jesus is the Son of God, people have tried to differentiate each Gospel by attributing a different specific primary attribute or title of Jesus. So Jesus has traditionally been pictured as the Son of David and a king in Matthew, as a suffering prophet in Mark, as a priest in Luke, and he is uniquely presented as the divine Logos, or Word of God, in John. While emphasizing these aspects of Jesus, he is all of these things in all of the Gospels, and these depictions are human fancy and imagination coming from the need to categorize things so that they could be more easily understood and remembered. Now, as all four of the Gospels are telling the same basic story of the life and ministry of Jesus Christ, it is worthwhile to note some of the ways in which they differ from each other. The first Gospel found in most New Testaments is named Matthew, after Matthew Levi, a Jewish tax collector from Capernaum, to whom Jesus said, "Follow me," and he did. This same Matthew was later selected by Jesus to be one of his 12 apostles, where the Greek word apostle means send forth, or one who is sent forth, as with a message. And notice that this is very similar to the word angel, which means simply messenger. So, when it comes to the message or the words of God, sent spirits are angels, and spirits that are sent in human bodies are apostles. In this case, the apostle is sent forth to spread the gospel, or the good news of the teaching and salvation that were spoken by Jesus. As with everything surrounding the Gospels, there has always been debate about whether the listed writer, Matthew, was actually Matthew Levi. One reason for this doubt is that there is little in Matthew's Gospel to indicate that the writer had ever been with Jesus himself. And apart from the calling of Matthew by Jesus, and the reception that Matthew gave for Jesus, and his inclusion in the lists of the 12 apostles, Matthew's Gospel does not mention Matthew, as in, there are no stories in any of the four Gospels that mention Matthew, or that mention Matthew interacting directly with Jesus. Either way, Matthew's account of the life of Jesus appears to be the most Jewish in flavor of the four Gospels, and it was clearly written for a Jewish audience, to prove to the Jewish people that Jesus was their Messiah, the Son of David and King of the Jewish people, as long promised to them by the prophets throughout the scriptures of the Old Testament, or the Israelite covenant, the Hebrew Tanakh. By contrast, it appears that the other three Gospels were written to take that good news of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ to the Gentiles, meaning those who are not Jewish, and in this case, at that time, it was the peoples of the Roman, Greek, and Hellenistic worlds, and elsewhere. So, to prove his point that Jesus is the long-expected Messiah, and that he fulfilled various key, important scriptures about himself, as the King of the Jews and as the Messiah, Matthew's Gospel includes around 200 quotations and references from the Old Testament. Matthew also uses a great many words, terms, symbols, and imagery that his Jewish audience would know and understand. For instance, the term Son of David is used 10 times in reference to Jesus. This is a term that was uniquely important to the Jewish people, as the Messiah was prophesied to sit upon the throne of David. David was a shepherd boy who was chosen by God to lead the Israelites, and he was in many ways the greatest king of Israel. David always sought God and prayed, and the book of Psalms contains many of his prayers and writings, and he was empowered and inspired by God to shepherd and lead God's people. In this case, to be a son of David meant that Jesus was not only the ruler or king of Israel, but that he was also lineally descended from King David as by blood, which Jesus was, according to the genealogy of Matthew's Gospel. Interestingly, and importantly in this case, is that David is the only name that is found on both Matthew and also Luke's genealogical list for the ancestral lineage of Jesus. As for the language of this Gospel, there is an ancient theory that Matthew's Gospel was originally composed in Hebrew, or possibly even in Aramaic, believed to be the language that Jesus himself spoke. Part of this is because of how Jewish in thought, style, and wording Matthew's Gospel is. But this is ancient speculation, because the oldest manuscripts that we have are in Greek, as are those of the other three Gospels. Have you ever wondered if the Romans, who spoke Latin, controlled the world and Palestine and Jerusalem during the life of Jesus, and afterwards for hundreds of years, why were the four Gospels, and in fact all 27 of the little books of the New Testament, written in Greek? Most of the answer is that Israel borders on the Mediterranean Sea, and at the time of Jesus, some 2,000 years ago, the Greek Empire had been in control of that region for over 300 years. When Jesus was born, Rome had only begun its expansion of empire. The Romans conquered Jerusalem in 63 BCE, or just 60 or so years before Jesus was born. So, because the Romans were recent arrivals, especially at that far end of the Mediterranean Sea where Israel was, the Greek culture and language, which had been established there for about 300 years, was still dominant throughout that part of the world at that time. Either way, Matthew was placed first of the four Gospels in most New Testaments, perhaps not because it was written first, even if in Aramaic or Hebrew, but because of the four Gospels, it is the most Jewish in flavor and style of the Old Testament. Some have seen that the structure of this Gospel appears to be in 5 parts, mimicking the layout of the 5 books of the Hebrew Torah, or the Pentateuch in Greek. So, for these reasons, Matthew's Gospel has long been seen as a type of bridge between the Old Testament promises to the Jewish peoples and their fulfillment in the life of the Messiah, Jesus, and therefore it was placed as the first Gospel of the 4 by Jerome in the Latin Vulgate Bible that was produced some 400 years later, in 405 CE. The second of the 4 Gospels is Mark, supposedly named for an early Jewish convert who was named John, and whose father was likely a Roman who had the surname Mark. This John Mark traveled with both the Apostle Peter, to whom Peter refers to Mark as a spiritual son, and also with Paul. It is believed that Mark may have acted as a Greek interpreter or translator for Peter, the chief of the apostles, and that Mark's Gospel, therefore, contains details, stories, and information that he heard and learned from Peter. From the text itself, there is no suggestion that this John Mark had ever been with or personally met Jesus. Mark is the shortest of the Gospels, and many believe that it was actually the first of the 4 Gospels to have been written, and we will explore the Gospel of Mark in more detail in the next section. The third and longest Gospel is that of Luke, who was a physician, a doctor who accompanied Paul on several of his missionary journeys to spread the word of Jesus. In the opening of Luke's Gospel, he says that he interviewed eyewitnesses and people who Jesus knew and who had been connected with his life, and by this, Luke admits that he himself had never met Jesus. This same Luke is also identified as the man who wrote the Book of the Acts of the Apostles, which details the missionary efforts of the apostles and Paul and the early spread of the church after the death of Jesus. A clue for this is that both the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts are addressed to the same Theophilus, or Theophilus, which means lover of God. But whether this was an individual, like a benefactor of Luke or Paul's, or a special Pauline term for all Christians, for those who love God, no one really knows. Another clue that this Luke also wrote the Book of Acts is the use of the word we at the times when Luke was with Paul in the Book of Acts. The final big clue is that Luke and Acts were originally bound and read together as one single book, until John's Gospel was added between them in the Vulgate New Testament. So you can see that the Vulgate Bible, in putting John as the last of the 4 Gospels, changed the sequence from John, Luke, Acts to Luke, John, Acts, and in doing so, the continuity that was built into Luke and Acts is lost. As for Luke, he claims to have put things in consecutive order, but in many ways, when compared with the other 3, it appears that his Gospel is the most broken in terms of chronological sequence, and is the most disjointed. And this may be the case when the story that you can construct is compiled from the testimonies of witnesses given so many years after the fact. And that brings us to the Gospel of John. The writer of this Gospel was likely John Zebedee, a fisherman from Capernaum, who, along with his brother James, were among the 12 apostles who were called and chosen by Jesus. Of the 12 apostles, John may have been the closest to Jesus and the one that Jesus loved, as it records 3 times in John's Gospel. John perhaps used this term in reference to himself in the third person as a way of remaining anonymous, perhaps for the sake of humility. John, along with his brother James and also Peter, were the only witnesses on several occasions during the ministry of Jesus, such as when Jesus was transfigured on the mountain with Moses and Elijah, and when Jesus allowed only them to enter the house of a synagogue official, where he resurrected to life a little girl who had died. There is little dispute that John wrote his account last, and that he may have written it to provide stories and details that were not already mentioned in many other gospel accounts that would have been in circulation at the time when John finally decided to write his account of the sayings and teachings and stories of Jesus. The 3 Passovers during the ministry of Jesus that are mentioned only within John's Gospel. Without this information, reading just the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, or Luke might lead you to think that the entire ministry of Jesus lasted for only 1 short year, and you would know little about his teachings or ministry in Judea and Jerusalem, where Jesus taught the crowds during the feasts and festivals and came into conflict with the Pharisees and the scribes in the temple. Compared to the other 3, John's Gospel is very spiritually and theologically deep, and it emphasizes the divinity of Jesus as not only the Son of God, but also uniquely as the Logos, or the Word of God, a Greek term and concept that was completely foreign to the Jews and not mentioned in the other 3 Gospels. It is also likely that the same John wrote the 3 epistles, or little letters, in the New Testament that bear his name, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And it is probable that this John also wrote the highly symbolic and enigmatic Book of Revelation, or the Apocalypse, with its disturbing end-time imagery that heralds the glorious return of the Messiah to the earth. So, as I said, most of these details about each Gospel and its writer is largely speculation, but it is interesting. This ends Part 3 of the Synoptic Gospel overview of the Gospels.